My name is Heather Vokush, and welcome to Witnessing History. Now, today we are delighted to be with Vinie Burrows. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, I'm delighted that you have asked me to join you.
Indeed, indeed. Now, you were born in 1924, and you have been an artist and activist ever since.
I think so. And I like to think that I was born really in the first quarter of the 20th century, and I'll probably depart near the first quarter of the 21st century.
Or who knows? Maybe,
whatever.
Maybe we're going forever. So, are you born and raised in New York?
I was born in Harlem Hospital, which makes me a Harlemite and a native New Yorker. And we lived in Central Harlem. I can remember almost every place that we lived, and certainly growing up 143 St. Nicholas Avenue. When I was maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, the camaraderie of poor people in Harlem, black and white, all poor, all joined together with their poverty, but not really in one sense, at least the children. We didn't know we were poor. The boys used to steal potatoes. They called the potatoes Mickeys, and it had something to do with the famine and the potatoes and the Irish. And they would steal potatoes and make a fire.
So you lived in a mixed-race neighborhood?
Yes, it was a mixed-race neighborhood. And interestingly enough, not in the building. Well, in the building, there were Hispanic people. I had a very good friend, Marguerite Rivera. But the neighbors on some parts of St. Nicholas Avenue, and certainly on 8th Avenue, were white. And the adolescents who were doing that stealing they were black and white. We lived actually opposite Graham Court, which still exists and was then only for white people. I also remember Adam Clayton Powell, and the boycott that he had on 125th Street saying, "Don't shop where you can't work," because that was the main shopping center where everybody shopped, and they still do shop there. But no black people were salespersons. There was a big clamor and uproar, "Don't shop where you can't work." It was
Yeah, well, it's a good slogan, I would say. And do you remember at that time, and this was, the Depression and all of this, do you remember feeling racial prejudice, or was everybody just so poor that everybody was joining together, or how did it work?
I think if there was any prejudice or discrimination, I found it, we lived near a Catholic church. We were Catholic, and my brother actually went to Catholic school. And I remember once one of the brothers, one of the teachers, saying that my brother had scored the highest of any person in the school. He said, "Well, is it high, of course, for a Negro?"
Oh, okay, okay. And meanwhile, you were starting to be an actress even as a child. You were on radio and on Broadway.
Yes, my mother worked for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and they had a program for the children of workers, and I became involved in that program. And it was from that early beginning that I became not enamored, but in love with words and language and how one uses words and the meaning of words. Then when I was in school, actually, I was in a play, and I didn't realize that I was auditioning when the teachers asked every girl to read a poem, and I read the poem, and then they said I had the role of the queen in Six Who Pass While the Lentils Boil. I must read that play at some point. And anyway, the day came and we had a performance, and I was dressed in blue blue serge with white cotton simulating ermine, and I walked down the corridor in old-fashioned school. All of the doors were rolled back, and all of the classes were exposed, and
my
I performed.
goodness.
And then afterwards, I took a bow along with the others, and I heard this sound. It was a magical sound.
And I'm sure that you've heard it many times since
I never
then.
forgot it. I loved it. I said, so that's what it's all about, you know.
And what age was that approximately?
I was probably about in the 5th or 6th grade then.
Okay.
But talking about even younger, I remember people's belongings on the sidewalk, people being evicted, and how horrible that was. And when I talked about camaraderie, I remember that when people didn't pay their light bill, Con Edison turned off the light, and neighbors would
chip in and maybe...
no, not chip in, they would get
Oh, the cord
extension cords
share
and
it.
put them in the foyer or in the
Okay.
lobby, and then you could get light. You could get electricity.
Okay, so there was this community feeling.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And one, a community feeling around the poverty, and two, you were just becoming a star, you know, at this time.
No.
But then World War II hit, I mean, right around this time, possibly later. What are your memories of before that time or during that
The
time?
strongest memories I have would be of male relatives who would come and visit my mother in uniform, saying, I'm in the service and I'm going to be sent overseas. And I also remember a second migration of relatives from the South who came to work in defense factories in Jersey. And I also remember the feeling that we were fighting for freedom abroad, but we had no freedom here, very, very strongly. So it was we were fighting two wars. We were fighting a war overseas, but we were also fighting a war here for dignity, for jobs, for housing, for equality.
And we being the African American population.
Yeah,
Well, that's a
African-American
very interesting distinction that you made there. And at the time, you were maybe around 18 or something like that. You were
Yes.
in your late teens. Your relatives who came, who later said that they were going to go abroad to serve, they were in segregated units.
Absolutely.
I'm assuming. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And did they come home, or did you lose any of them to war,
Well,
or?
Very few did I, those that lived in Jersey, I saw them, but interestingly enough, I don't remember much of their war experience, except for one relative who actually went very high in the service, and used to talk about Colin Powell. He said it was just a question of luck. But no, interestingly, I did some research and came across a book written by someone who teaches now at Columbia University, a woman, and she was talking about women and progressive politics during World War II. So I came across, and I knew Pearl Primus, you know, and Hazel Scott, who was married to Adam Clayton Powell, who was one of the most highly paid Cafe Society artists, and also Mary Lou Williams, the jazz singer, arranger, composer, musician, extraordinary. She had a salon where everybody came, and she became quite well known as an educator and someone who talked about discrimination and talked about the power of music and the power of the arts to change.
I would say that you also have done exactly the same thing. I mean, you have become such a force talking about this distinction that you mentioned. How can we have freedom here you know, if we're not fighting there. Can you tell us a little bit about your own extraordinary background with activism? When did you start this?
I was a member of CNA, Committee for Negroes in the Arts, and we put on plays at Club Baron.
And I'm sorry, when was this?
Oh, probably in the
A while ago.
yeah, maybe 50s, maybe 50s.
Okay, okay.
Before the impact of Martin Luther King and before Emmett Till and the intense civil rights movement. Before that, we were Committee for the Negro in the Arts. And I also remember that there were whites who were also involved in progressive theater. I remember Eli Wallach and his wife Ann Jackson. We were all involved in Stage for Action. We worked out of a place on 42nd Street.
Stage for Action.
Stage for Action.
And what was the focus there? What was the political focus or the message? Was it, you said progressive politics?
Yes, progressive politics. The focus on poverty,
okay,
unemployment,
okay,
and what it does for families and people. Then, of course, when the war started, Stage for Action was open up the second front, you know, the Western Front. There was Japan, you know, and when Japan...
Regarding World War II.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and then, you know, all of the different fighting in different places. Do you remember when, like in 1945, basically, when they said that the war was over, was there any acknowledgement in your neighborhood, or did people...
I wanted to go to 42nd Street.
Okay.
I remember that distinctly because, I was so torn by Bataan, Iwo Jima, more than, interestingly enough, than the Western Front. And I went to 42nd Street, and I got off the subway, and I saw this immense crowd and was terrified of all these white people.
Oh, and the 42nd Street.
And the joy, I couldn't celebrate with them.
And the 42nd Street was the celebration of the
Times
ending
Square.
of... Okay.
Yeah, everybody was there except me.
And so
I was afraid to go.
You were afraid to go?
I was afraid to be around that many white people. Isn't it interesting?
What were you afraid would happen? That you would be attacked, or it would be, what were you afraid?
Maybe because I was short, because I was young, but it was all those white people together was menacing.
Okay.
In their joy, they would be menacing to me, which says something about...
Yeah, it sure does.
Where did it come from? It came from my cousins who would come from the South to my mother. They would always come by there, and I would hear tales of... I remember those from Texas would talk about only seeing a white man's boot, you know, on them. It took me a long while to even be cordial to white Texans. And it wasn't until I had a white Texan neighbor that I liked that I could say, well, maybe that they weren't all like that.
Well, you know, you also went because it was difficult to even find roles, you know, that weren't for, you know, white, you know, people.
It's these, them, and those roles. I often say that the reason I started with, and I was fortunate in the sense that I had 7 Broadway shows almost immediately, and they came in rapid succession. But I was in Berlin just immediately before the wall, actually, dedicating a building that had been built with American money, and I was there with Thornton Wilder and Eileen Heckert and Martha Graham Oh yes,
My goodness.
Yes, yes. When Martha Graham met the
Chancellor or something like that,
no,
possibly.
but they were together. This woman, I used to remember her name, a famous dancer, and they embraced.
My goodness.
So she was with us also.
Well, I'm still swooning over Thornton Wilder, the fact that you were
Yes,
with
yes,
that. That's
yes.
amazing.
And we became good friends, actually. He was a very, very generous man, very kindly man.
But what's also great is that you went on to just write, one-woman shows, because you're like, well, if these roles aren't here, I'm going to write them.
When we went to Germany, I shared a dressing room with Lillian Gish.
Oh, my
Her
goodness.
sister was still alive at the time. And I was in the play, and I came off stage, and I got a hand when I left. And Lillian, and I said as I came in, I'm going to give up the theater. And she said, why? I said, because I've been in theater for almost 10 years, and all the roles are these, them, and those. I've never had a role like this. Just an ordinary person, an ordinary human being, and I said, I'm going to give it up. She says, well, she had no sympathy for me. She said, you have talent. You have to find a way to use that talent. And that's when really the idea of the one-woman shows came to me.
And you've done 8 so far,
yes.
very successful shows that have been performed across the world, literally. But not only have you done those, you've done radio. You had your own radio show talking about progressive political causes.
Yes, and I enjoyed that so very much.
A
More
lot
than
of
half
television.
the world,
Yeah, a lot of television. So you've certainly hit many media in your, performing and also in your writing. I'd like to take a minute to talk about your activism. I see you have a Granny Peace Brigade button on right now.
Yes,
Can you
I do.
tell us a little bit about this group?
Well, the grannies and are an extraordinary group of women, over 50, many in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, like I am, and I think we have several grannies who are 100. Who have retired from, work, teaching, social work, nursing, a great many of them, and wanted to use their energies to do something about the world, about the war in Iraq. And they decided, well, they were going to go down to the recruiting center and say, we have lived our lives, take us and send the young ones home. So we went to the recruiting center and they arrested us.
You were there?
Yes,
you were one of the people who was arrested?
Yes, I was arrested.
Okay, and that was like 2007 or something like that?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
And then they remained together as a group and branched out into other areas, always in terms of war and peace and the violence of war. And the violence, I'd say also, the violence of poverty and the violence of racism. Because poverty is a weapon of mass destruction also.
Well put.
Now very much involved with drones, with the whole issue of drones, and we were involved with military bases, but always with war and the consequences of war to people and to Earth, to the planet.
May I ask, what is the thing that has motivated you to do this work? What motivated you to go down there and get arrested?
Interestingly enough, in 1977, there was the first World Conference of Women at the UN, and out of that conference grew certainly a profound interest worldwide, globally, on the status and condition of women. And a group, NGO, Women's International Democratic Federation, decided to have a conference in East Berlin and they wanted a diverse group of Americans, and I was chosen because I was an artist, because I was black, and because I was interested, you know.
And interesting.
Yeah. So I went, and there discovered, there were 2,000 women, and there discovered, under the umbrella of the Women's International Democratic Federation, women from all over the world, 2,000 women, a large group from India, from Cambodia, from Laos.
Must have been an extraordinary event.
It was. But
Wow.
there I discovered women who were talking not only about sexism, but about racism. And I hadn't found that in the United
Really?
States.
Okay.
So-
Really?
Oh, yes.
You
yes,
had not found that in the United States.
I had thought of the women's movement in the United States as a largely white women, middle-class women, not involved with issues of poverty, not involved with issues of women of color. But that changed when I went to Berlin, and I met like-minded women from the United States. And when we came back, we formed an organization, Women for Racial and Economic Equality, and affiliated with the WIDF. And then the WIDF sent us a message saying, we have status with the UN, and we would like to have one of our members be our UN representative. Well, as an actress, which meant I didn't have a full-time job, I was just taking care of my children and occasionally working, I filled the bill. So I became the UN rep. And there began an absolutely extraordinary, life-changing learning experience about the role of the United States in world politics, the role of capitalism in politics, and saw it displayed and blatantly and brazenly as I would go to various meetings. And so then the whole question of internationalism and how does one change the world?
Well, these are all really good questions. So
Yes,
let's say
yes.
with standing with your amazing experiential background and wisdom at this point, when you look at the world, are you optimistic, pessimistic regarding the future for those kids and those grandkids?
Well, they said many years ago it's 1 minute to midnight. We could almost say that now. But because I have children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren, and because the grannies, and I think we all feel this way very strongly, that what we do is for the life of the children that follow us. What kind of life will they have? What kind of world are we living them? What tools are we giving them, you know, to struggle? Because it is a struggle to make this. It's a continuous struggle to make this a better world. Who is the enemy?
Yeah.
You know? And there are many enemies, and sometimes the enemy is us.
I think this is your next one-woman show, actually. I'll come front row.
well.
But I guess this segues into the crystalline question, and that is, if you have one message that you would like to share with young people everywhere across the world, what would that be?
That we are not individuals. We have self, but we belong to the larger self.
And the larger self is the community.
Is the community.
So we're going...
Is the world. It's the world. We are really, whatever your religious background, we are children of one Creator, and we must bind together as children, as inhabitants of this home that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Take care of each other and take care of the home. The home is the earth, the universe.
In a way, it's interesting because now we've gone full circle back to the place that you were brought up, and then people were helping each other with the electricity, and it was poverty, but people were sharing together. So I can't begin to thank you enough for the inspiration and the wisdom that you have shared with us today. It was such an honor and a pleasure to be able to talk to you. Thank you so much.
I
Thank
spoke from the heart.
And that's
I
clear.
spoke from the experience of someone who has been here almost 90 years.
Yeah, and we are grateful for both, all of those. Thank you for joining us, and we would highly encourage you to visit Vinie Burrows' website so you can learn more about her. Thank you very much.